Everyone. I'm Josh McElwee. I think some of you know me. I'm recognizing many names that I know. It's really wonderful to see you all here today. So I'm in Rome with Chris in these days. I'm the news editor of NCR, erstwhile Vatican correspondent, helping out as we cover the October 4 through 29 Synod of Bishops. So you may have seen a lot of our coverage at ncronline.org. Chris and I have also launched a new podcast called The Vatican Briefing. It's available wherever you might listen to a podcast, on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, wherever you might get those. And what we're doing in these days is covering the Synod up close, going to press briefings, meeting with members of the Synod as they go in and out of the sessions, and trying to get as much of the information as we can about what's going on in the room. Obviously, Pope Francis called this gathering 2 years ago. Some of you may have been involved in some of the preparation sessions at the different levels. Right now, a lot of the sessions are happening kind of behind closed doors. Pope Francis has asked the members of the Synod, there's about 460 participants with about 350 voting members. Pope Francis has asked the members to keep confidentiality or discretion about some of the discussions. And the purpose of that seems to be to allow them to have open, honest conversations. Obviously, as journalists, it's a bit of a frustration that we're not getting kind of as much information as we might have gotten in past synods, but at the same time, we're able to talk to members and get information. So I think we're here and very happy to meet with you and take whatever questions. And I'll let Chris say a few words as well.
Thank you all for joining us. I see our friend from Tasmania is joining at 5 a.m. Local time, so that's a real commitment. So a special thanks to you. We're really just grateful to be here covering the Synod and for your loyal support of NCR that makes it possible. As Josh mentioned, some of you have perhaps been taking part in this Synod or feel like you've been a part of it because it's been going on at various levels for the past 2 years. So I think one of the things I just want to convey is the sense of excitement here in Rome. It's a real buzzing atmosphere because so many people from all over the world feel like they have a stake in this, and they feel like for the first time, perhaps since the Second Vatican Council, that the Church is really interested in taking a new approach to listening to all of the people of God and not just the hierarchy of the Church. And it's our job to sort of tell that story and chronicle it day in and day out. It's been a bit more difficult than past synods, as Josh mentioned, because of these somewhat difficult regulations put on synod members about talking to media. I think it's been explained to us that the Pope is sort of treating this as if all of these delegates are on a spiritual retreat together, and he doesn't want that process of discernment to be interrupted. As journalists, however, we believe in a lot in transparency and accountability. And so we're doing our best to get people to talk to us in any way that they can and relay that back to you. So I think one important thing to remember is that this is the second week, but only day 5 of the Synod. So we're just ramping up here. Cardinal Hollerich, he's a Jesuit cardinal from Luxembourg. He said I think it was yesterday at the start of this week, that it's only now where they're expecting tensions to emerge in the room as they start to wade into some of these more neuralgic or sensitive issues. So at the moment, the theme that the Synod delegates are discussing is that of communion. So how the Church might be inviting and incorporate more marginalized voices in the Church, but also improve its relationship with other Christian churches and other religions. And then next week, they're going to, or at the end of this week and into next week, they'll be moving into discussions, particularly about the role of ministries, including that of women. And we're expecting them to talk about the issue of women deacons. So that's when we're going to get into the meat of some of these issues that I know a lot of you are eager to follow. But we've got a lot of questions, and in the spirit of the Synod, we really want this to be a conversation. So we're going to dive right into the questions. And I think Josh and I will just ping pong back and forth with some of these questions that you've already submitted to us. But just a reminder that there's a chat box that we'll be drawing from as well. So it's not too late to get your questions in. But Josh, I'm going to just throw a question at you from one of the pre-submitted questions. And one of the questions is, does everyone who can vote also have a part in the discussions, and are there time presentations? So
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I mean, what's interesting, something that's interesting about this synod is that it's arranged quite differently than previous synods. So this is actually my fifth synod covering Pope Francis holding a synod in Rome. The previous four synods, like all other synods, I think since the 1980s, were held in a small stadium-style hall on the upper level of the Paul VI Hall in the Vatican City State, and the delegates of the synod sat in a stadium-style seating, kind of like in a movie theater. So it was on an angle, and at the bottom of the angle was the Pope at a dais with all the other important people. This synod is quite different in that it's arranged in round tables. They've moved the synod out of the second floor of Paul VI Hall into the main audience hall where the Pope might have his weekly Wednesday audiences. You've seen pictures of that, I'm sure, if you've seen the Pope do his weekly audiences. Sometimes that's where the Pope will meet with kind of interesting groups, such as circus folk or people who are giving a performance for the Pope. You may have seen photos of that. It typically can hold, I think, between 8 and 15,000 people, so it's a big room. And what they've done is they've taken half the room, taken the chairs out of it, raised the floor, and put in these round tables so that the 460 delegates to the synod can sit around these round tables. There's about 12 people at each table. The tables are mixed up, so there's no really hierarchy to where people are sitting. You know, a cardinal sitting next to a bishop, sitting next to a layperson, sitting next to a sister, and the groups are divided by language, working language, and interest. So the cardinals and all the members were asked about in the specific parts of the working document what interested them, and that's how it was split up. So to that question about time presentations, there's a flow to the Synod assembly. Each week has a few number of general sessions in the hall where there are a few timed presentations, but mainly a lot of the Synod work this time around is done in these small groups around the table. And I think Chris and I have had similar discussions with Synod members where what we're hearing is that these table discussions are being pretty fruitful, allowing for more open dialogue, allowing for more people to speak. They've also set up the hall in an interesting way so that each table has, at the center of the table, these tablets that each of the members can use. And there's a camera at the center of each table so that when someone is speaking to the hall, the camera looks at that person and projects their image on everyone's tablet at all the tables. So it's very dialogical, very different, and very open-ended. Maybe I'll pong a question over to Chris now. Let me find a really hard one for Chris White, the Vatican correspondent. Let's see here. I'll give you an easy one, Chris. There's a question here. I was so impressed by Dominican Father Timothy Radcliffe's presentations. How were they received by the attendees? Maybe, Chris, you want to talk about those and talk about what we've heard from people about those reflections.
Yeah. So as loyal NCR readers, you probably all know that the Synod began not on October 4th with the discussions in the here at the Vatican, as Josh just mentioned, but actually on September 30th, when all the delegates were taken away outside of Rome for 3 days of discussions and this sort of retreat led by Dominican Father Timothy Radcliffe. And I'd encourage you all to take a listen to these meditations that he gave. They're about half hour each, and he gave 6 in total. If you don't have that sort of time, Josh and I did a roundup of some of the major themes that he talked about, and that's available, of course, at NCR Online. But almost to a person that we've spoken with, people have pinpointed those days together in prayer, and particularly listening to Father Radcliffe as a time of just real sort of community bonding, centering, and something very specific to this particular synod process. And I think for a lot of people who have recognized this synod is addressing a number of themes that have the possibility for contentious debate, they saw this as a chance to sort of take a step back, get to know each other, and primarily begin in a spirit of prayer and listening. And those 3 days weren't the last we heard from Father Radcliffe. Just yesterday, he provided a biblical reflection on these days' theme on communion, And he's around in the Synod Hall this entire month. I'm told that there are delegates that are going to see him for spiritual direction, for confession, and there's also a spiritual mother as well. And that's a novelty or an invention of this synod, to sort of make this a through line throughout this entire month, and also to integrate this sort of this spiritual listening throughout the discussion. So when these formal presentations are given, the delegates hear from a speaker at the beginning of a new session, and then they all pause for 3 or 4 minutes of listening and reflection. And this is also done within the small groups as well. And so I think that's something that, Father Radcliffe has really been instrumental in bringing and inviting everyone into that sort of mindset. One of the things that he said, and I was just told yesterday that he was very insistent on, even in the lead up to this synod, that he really thought that all of the participants in the synod needed to actually live together for the entire duration of the synod, that they share every meal together, that they go to mass together and pray together daily. That, of course, isn't happening. We saw them do it for 3 days, and then they came to Rome. And as a reporter, I'm terrified of that prospect of them sort of being locked away behind closed doors for an entire month. But I think, as a Dominican who lives his life in community, that's something that he really has wanted to leave his mark on the synodal process. And he even said he'd like to see that next year, because it's important to remember that this month is just the first of 2 sessions of this synod on synodality. So,
That might
Josh,
be
go ahead.
well, that might be a good thing to just. I know that there was a question about where people are living while they're attending the synod. Yeah, you're probably getting there. But yeah, it's interesting. So they're all living in different places around Rome. Most of them are pretty close to the Vatican. The U.S. bishops are mostly staying at the Pontifical North American College, which is up on the Janico Hill, if any of you know Rome, and they're typically arriving on a bus together. But many of the attendees are staying at different houses around the Vatican city-state. The Maria Bambina, the Domus Sacerdotalis, which is down the Via della Conciliazione a bit. And every day we see them kind of walking in, some together, some alone. Most of them are arriving by foot. And the typical rhythm of the synod is there's a morning session and an afternoon session. So the morning session runs from about 8:45, starting with the morning prayer, until about 12:30, and then there's a break. And then the delegates come back at 4 p.m. and typically stay until 6:30, 7 p.m. And so it's interesting. We can, Chris and I or all the other journalists can, basically, we're not allowed inside the hall typically, except for the morning prayer, but we can stand outside the hall, and we can watch them come in and out and kind of try to do our journalistic duty and shake hands and ask some questions and see people as they walk in. But it's interesting to kind of this all the whole Vatican city-state is kind of oriented right now towards offering hospitality and letting the synod kind of conduct itself.
Yeah, it's been I think for especially in this synod when we aren't getting this sort of information officially that we've been getting in the past, these interactions are critical. So.
Yeah. Let's see here. Someone asks, how are you receiving information? Do you need underground informants?
Well, we're not paying anyone off, that's for sure. But Josh and I both are fortunate that we have a lot of contacts in the room that we're trying to have discreet conversation with. They're all trying to navigate for themselves what they can and can't say. But I'd say all day, every day, we're in contact via different ways, either in-person encounters, text messages, phone calls, lunches, dinners, to try to just get information out of people. So no paid informants, but just doing what journalists do. Right at the start of the synod, on the first day, we received, and all the participants received this rule book on how they were to operate and conduct themselves over the entire month. And there's a section on communication, and it requests that they conduct themselves in a manner of confidentiality in regards to the discussion and to use their own discernment. And so what I've been saying is for people to really lean into the discernment. And if they discern well, surely they'll discern that they need to talk to us. So.
Chris said that during our podcast, and I thought that was a wonderful insight. Again, the podcast is the Vatican Briefing, if you want to give it a listen. We've got a
Josh,
number of comments here. Go ahead.
yeah, I mean, do you want to talk about, some people are asking a mix of, how are the tensions being handled? How is the Vatican dealing with the naysayers during the Synod sessions? Do you want to talk about some of those dynamics?
Yeah, I think maybe say two different things on that front. The first is in terms of naysayers about the process. I think it's important to mention kind of what Pope Francis did at the very beginning, or I guess the day before the Synod. Well, you may have seen, our members may have seen coverage of a letter from 5 cardinals kind of calling into question the purpose of the Synod, asking about why Francis was doing this, and presenting him with 5 dubia or 5 questions for him to answer. And these cardinals apparently wanted yes or no answers. One of which was about whether the church could bless same-sex unions, and the other was about whether it was okay or whether the church could ordain women. I think it said specifically as priests. And Francis, it was quite interesting. Normally, the Vatican does not respond. You know, in the past, I think it was the Family Synod, a similar letter like this in 2015 emerged, and the Vatican essentially never responded. Pope responded to questions about that in questions with journalists on the plane when he was traveling abroad, but there was no real official response from the Vatican. This time it was entirely different. I think it was only a couple hours after this was made public. I think I got notice that the Vatican was going to be releasing something, and so did Chris. And it was what Pope Francis had written back to these cardinals, I think in September, to respond to their dubia, and it was quite extraordinary. The two things that Chris and I highlighted in our story was Francis essentially said he could see a scenario in which the Catholic Church could bless same-sex unions as long as they did not, as long as that did not kind of contradict the Church's teaching in terms of the sacrament of matrimony, which Francis and the Church considers to be reserved to a marriage of one man and one woman. But the Pope essentially said, when people are asking for a blessing, they're asking for help. They're asking for some sort of assistance from God, and he didn't think the Church could. He thought there might be a scenario in which the Church could offer that to them. The second question, in terms of women's ordination, Francis repeated what John Paul II had said in 1994, but also said, he wasn't sure in terms of what it meant that John Paul II had said that teaching had to be definitively held by the faithful. And he kind of said, well, that doesn't mean it's dogmatic. It's not quite clear what that means, but we can study it, just as we do study the ordinations of women in the Anglican Communion. I found that interesting on its merits, but it's also interesting that Francis decided to release this ahead of the Synod in terms of saying, maybe a message there in terms of saying nothing is off the table, which is a message he's given to the Synod before. I remember in 2014 at the first Family Synod, Francis's opening remarks were nothing should be off the table and everyone should speak boldly. And I think that's kind of the same message we got this time, but a bit more concretely and with a bit more of a sense of forward movement possibly on some church doctrinal issues. Was there something else there, Chris? I think I missed the second part of that.
Well, I think you handled it. There was just the other part was about the naysayers during the Synod sessions. I think, from what I've been told, there are, maybe reports of 1 or 2 sharp exchanges here or there happening in small group discussions. But at this point, if you think back on Cardinal Hullerich's words yesterday that I mentioned, that they're just sort of now easing into the tensions and the issues that are going to be divisive. There hasn't really been any episodes in the room of sparks flying. So The other thing I just wanted to mention is that we're also joined here in Rome these days by our Global Sisters Report colleague, Rena Guidos, and who's done some excellent interviews specifically focused on the religious women that are here in the Synod. And they make up a sizable number, and we're really grateful to have her here with us. She's been hustling nonstop, and also just providing us a lot of good cheer along the way. So we're happy to have her here with us.
Yeah. On that front too, it's interesting. We got notice today of two commissions of the Synod. So the Synod elected some members of two commissions. One commission is they're calling, I think, the Commission for Information, which is essentially a commission to determine how the Synod interacts with the media or what information it puts out on the day-to-day basis. But on the other commission, which is essentially the commission that will help guide and eventually start editing the final document coming from the Synod. Something quite interesting today is that one of the members is a woman religious, Sister Pat Murray, who is the executive director of the Rome-based organization of Catholic Sisters around the world. It's kind of the organization doesn't quite oversee, but helps coordinate the different Catholic sisters around the world, called the International Union of Superiors General. I think that's the first time there's been a woman on that editing commission, and it's quite significant. She's the only woman on the commission, but certainly quite interesting, and quite interesting that it would be a woman religious and someone very well known in Rome, and someone very well respected for being a organizer, writer, in many different ways.
We've got a question here. Is there any sense that people with different ideas, perspectives, are actually listening and sharing and having dinner informally? I'll just share two brief anecdotes. Josh may have others to share. There was a picture that kind of got some traction on social media of two German bishops that were walking together, and the photographer that took the photo caught them having this conversation where they appear to be laughing quite a bit. And these two German bishops are known to be quite at loggerheads when it comes to the discussions happening inside Germany with their own synodal way. And they're both here in Rome as delegates to Pope Francis's big synod. And back at home, they've got some pretty strong disagreements. But I think that image of the two of them walking in and sharing a laugh did surprise some people. And then the first day of the synod, when they were all arriving, when the North Americans got off their bus, Josh and I were out front, and we had a video of them all kind of stepping down and walking in. And a few people commented when we posted the video online that they thought it was odd to see Cardinal Supich of Chicago and Cardinal Dolan in New York, again, having a laugh and talking as they went in the room. I mean, one of the things that I think it is important to remember is that, some of these people, despite ideological disagreements, have gone to school together. They've been at other synods together before, and so they've got longstanding relationships. And so I think one of the Pope's intentions here is that spending a month together in serious conversations, that we'll see more of that. There's plenty of examples we kind of have when we go into the Synod Hall in the morning to go for morning prayer. You get a bird's eye view of the room, and that's one of my hobbies, is to see who are the odd couples seated next to each other. So.
Chris has a column coming on Thursday. I think that's okay to say, that addresses some of these snapshots from the room. You should look for it on Thursday. It's quite funny and quite interesting, and captures some of the unique images of some of the pairings at the tables, people you wouldn't expect to be sitting next to each other, who we know have diverse views and now are, because of this process or because of what they selected on the form when they asked what round tables they would be at. They're now seated at these round tables and presumably are having very interesting discussions together.
Yeah. And one of the questions we've gotten is, are they at the same table all month? And they're not. They rotate with their sort of 5, what they're calling modules, or 5 sessions of particular themes over the course of the synod. And each time they enter into a new module, the table makeup completely differs. Cardinal Tobin from Newark, New Jersey, was one of the folks at the Vatican press conference today talking about his experience. And I found it quite interesting. During the first week, he said that he was in a Spanish language group. He's quite an accomplished linguist and speaks a number of languages. And he said he was the only non-Latin American in his group. So it's not just all Americans around one table. You're getting Africans and Asians and Americans in an English language group. And then you might have a Spanish language group with folks like Cardinal Tobin. So you can really see, it's just a strange, cross-pollination of different people and backgrounds at these roundtables.
Mm-hmm. Maybe it would be good. There was a question before, in the questions that came before people joined, about how Francis is taking part in the synod, if he's involved in the discussions, that type of thing. Do you want to answer that, Chris?
Sure. So I think to date, we've seen the Pope a handful of occasions, I think on 3 different days. He was certainly there on day 1. He spoke, and that was an address primarily aimed at sort of the spirit of the event, sort of speaking about the media situation. He was saying that he wanted delegates to basically go on a fast from media, because in past synods, the synod experience has been reduced to 1 or 2 particular issues, and he didn't want to see that with this synod. And then he's come back in the room for when the groups have all come back together after their small group sessions, and they just kind of have an open mic night, sort of, where they all can kind of, come to the microphone and speak freely. And he's been present for a few of these sessions, including this afternoon. But because the synod is structured differently and so much of it is happening in small groups, we're not seeing him, all day, every day. But he has been there taking notes, and with individuals before and after and during coffee breaks. I think, I wasn't at his first synod in 2014. I know Josh was. But I think it shocked people to see Pope Francis being a part of just the mix during the coffee hour and walking to work on his own with his briefcase. So we are seeing him still interact with delegates, but to date, perhaps a little less than past synods. So
there are some nice photos emerging too of the Pope arriving at the hall a little early or staying a little late, and just greeting with people or letting people come greet him, which has been really lovely to see. I think the South African woman, Sheila Pires, who is on the Commission for Information, she's the vice president helping the Vatican's the chief communications official with communication from the Synod. She posted photos, I think this afternoon, of herself with the Pope, and a long line of people just coming to greet the Pope. Father Jim Martin from America Magazine, who's a Synod delegate or Synod member, did the same. It's kind of nice to see, and the Pope is seated at one of the round tables. His table is it's on a dais that's maybe a foot higher than the other tables. It's not very high, but there's a sense of he's kind of, if not quite the same level, almost the same level as everyone else. He does, however, have a bigger chair, which is pretty funny. He has all the chairs in the room are the same, except his has armrests that are a little bigger.
And his tablet, Josh mentioned that they all have tablets, and they're all just your standard, tablets like this, and they're all black or gray, and his is white. So, Josh, we've got a question from Bill Mitchell. Hi, Bill. Saying, do you expect the Pope will wait until the conclusion of next year's session to sort of tip his hand on the consequential issues, or might we get some sort of inkling at the close of this year's session? So yeah, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, they haven't really. I mean, it's not very clear exactly what we should expect in terms of a final document. I think we are expecting a final document, as far as I know, what we've heard and what they've said publicly about the Synod, that there will be some sort of document the Synod votes on at the end of this session. A typical pattern in synods is, a synod would vote on a final document. It would be about the last week of the synod. There would be about a draft of a final document that was circulating. Often that draft would be in only one language, which made it difficult for some whoever didn't speak that language made it more difficult. And then they would vote on that document basically paragraph by paragraph. And it would be, I think it's a 2/3 vote, right, Chris, that it requires for it to be considered approved by the synod. And so earlier in the Francis papacy, we saw scenarios, I think it was the second family synod, where there were a couple paragraphs of a document that got close but still squeaked by in terms of voting. But ultimately, there is one synod that issued its own document in 1971 with its own authority. But since then, every synod has issued a document that goes to the Pope for consideration, basically. And typically the Pope releases a few months later an apostolic exhortation that would kind of summarize the discussions or maybe make some sort of decision from those discussions. We've seen that in the Francis papacy several times. The famous example is Amoris Laetitia after the family synods, at which Francis addressed especially issues of the communion for the divorced and remarried, Catholics who are divorced and remarried, or ministry to LGBTQ Catholics. We saw that again after the conclusion of the Amazon Synod. The Pope put out an apostolic exhortation called Carita Amazonia that addressed some of the issues of that synod. So if it were to follow that model, I think it's more likely that the Pope would wait for the conclusion of both the synod in 2023 and 2024 before he would to write some sort of exhortation. But from everything we've been told, I'm expecting that we will have some sort of final document. It would at least summarize the discussions up to this point. And it could still be quite interesting, even if it's not definitive or if it's not something that makes a lot of decisions, because there are still a lot of interesting items on the table, particularly with regard to the possibility of ordained ministry for Catholic women.
The only other thing I'd add to that is that today, when Cardinal Tobin was at the Vatican press conference, he talked about all the work that's been done on the local level leading up to this point. And he said that when this synod ends, this session of this synod ends in October, he expects there'll be homework to do. And what he was getting at there is this widely understood, but at this point ambiguous expectation that whatever document is crafted during these weeks, this month, will then go back out to the people of God for some sort of second round of listening sessions or comment, so that it's sort of in the same spirit that the synod began with inviting people at the grassroots level to contribute to the process, so that the sort of circle continues. So we've asked for clarification on this at various press conferences in the past, and I think they're still working out what this is going to look like. I will say, this is a massive operation that has been organized in just a few years' time, and there are lots of moving parts. And sometimes that can be quite frustrating because there are areas that are a bit gray and we're not sure how it's all going to work. But somehow it is working and moving forward. And if you think of how small the staff of the Synod office is here in Rome, there are just about 20 employees, and they're pulling off a massive program here. So.
Yeah.
Josh, someone is asking about the what are participants wearing, and particularly if bishops are dressed down. Do you want to talk about this?
Yeah, it's something that you actually mentioned in your column tomorrow or Thursday, Chris. On the first day of the synod, almost all the bishops were wearing the formal cassock with the zucchetto, and kind of as you would if you were at a formal meeting at the Vatican. On the second day, I think on the first afternoon even, that changed, and most bishops decided to just dress in a clerical outfit, clerical collar with a sport coat, and that's more or less been the dress code for the bishops. I've actually seen some bishops go in quite more informally, some with open collar, some without coats. It's unseasonably warm here in Rome for October. It's in the upper 80s at midday, so I think some people are dressing down even a bit more than usual. But it's typical at a synod that after the first day or so, bishops and priests kind of dress in the clerics, but don't dress in the cassocks. Um, and some of the members, I mean, keeping in mind that there are lay members, and there's lay members who are quite young. I don't know if they're college students who are quite right out of college, are dressing very informally, and I don't think anyone's batted their eyes at that. This is obviously they're very long days, and people are working pretty hard and trying to have honest conversations, and sometimes it's best just to be comfortable.
The the continental stages, the sort of the second level, where there were different assemblies in each region, that took place in Oceania. There were some great photos of that where you saw, bishops and cardinals in shorts and sort of Hawaiian t-shirts. We haven't seen anything quite that casual here at the Vatican yet, but who knows? We've got a few more weeks to go. So.
We've had a question here about outside groups at the Synod. Maybe this is a good time to talk about that. There's a question about this Spirit Unbounded event that's taking place. I think it started yesterday or today. That's one of many events. Maybe Chris, you want to talk about that a little bit, or?
Yeah, there's a number of events taking place. We've had coverage of this at NCR on the 3rd, so the eve of the Synod. There was a prayer vigil sponsored by the Women's Ordination Conference, and this was on the other side of town, but in a Roman basilica, and it took place in this chapel with a number of testimonials and prayers from women across the world talking about their own hopes, but also their own disappointments and challenges within the church, and their hopes for the Synod, particularly as these questions of ministry come to the surface, particularly that around women's ordination. There have been clergy abuse survivor groups. One big group was trying to push a law to be adopted surrounding zero tolerance, which gets kind of complicated in canon law because in many respects that is the law that's already on the books. But their presence was very much here and felt at the beginning of the Synod as well. And the Spirit Unbounded event taking place this week into this weekend, which we'll have coverage on at NCR with a lot of church reform groups. So I think that's very much in the atmosphere. I think it's important if you just think about the fact that this Synod is happening and the way in which it's happening, where there are some 70 lay delegates in the room who now get a vote. That comes, Pope Francis decided that this spring, but that comes after many years of church reform groups pushing for this. And so I think it's perhaps hard to gauge or to be able to really measure the short-term or immediate impact of their presence and witness here around an event. But when you think about how long people have pushed for women and lay people to have the right to vote at the Synod, and now we're seeing it take place. In a certain sense, I think it's fair to say that the way this Synod is functioning is a result of their presence and their work over the years. So, and particularly just the growth of so many of these groups in the years after the Second Vatican Council, leading up to now. So, Josh.
Yeah, I think Chris covered it. We're doing our best to cover as many groups here in Rome as possible. The Spirit Unbounded folks are meeting throughout the week, and then their two major keynote speakers are on Friday and Saturday. A Benedictine sister, Joan Chittister, who I'm sure many of you know, and a columnist at NCR for many years, and former Irish President Mary McElwee will also be giving an address. So our colleague, I think Rena Guidos, who is in Rome in these days, is planning to cover those, and you can probably look to either NCR Online or globalsistersreport.org for more coverage of that event.
One of the questions that we've gotten here is the role of lay people in the room, and can they speak at open mic sessions? And yeah, I think I just want to anyone that is at one of these roundtables can speak, and in fact have spoken both at will and through sort of prepared testimonials. So one of the things that we just yesterday we heard from, I believe it was a laywoman from Hong Kong and a laywoman from, was it Brazil? I think
Yes,
it was
yeah.
Brazil, that just sort of spoke both about their experience in the Synod up until now, but also the needs of their particular region. So I think that's something that we're going to hear all month. And the other thing that Synod delegates can do is submit a written intervention. We talked about these tablets, these fancy devices that everyone now has at their table. And once you submit a written intervention, that's just sort of something that's effectively sent to a Synod member's inbox for their own reading in their own time. So that's another way in which those in the room can sort of add to the conversation outside of the official open mic sessions. So.
Yeah, another thing we saw yesterday morning at the beginning of each section of the document, there's an open session that journalists can observe, or anyone can observe the live stream. And some of you may have seen Dominican Father Timothy Radcliffe give us another reflection yesterday morning. There was also a reflection from the theologian Anna Rowlands from Durham University in the UK, who gave a reflection on the concept of communion, which is what the Synod participants are discussing right now. And we're going to see that, I think, 3 more times now during the Synod. So the next time that will happen is on Friday morning, or Friday morning in Rome, when the participants move on to I guess it's the third part of the document now. They haven't, the Synod office hasn't said yet who will be giving those reflections, but you will be seeing those, and I would expect it would be another theologian perhaps.
Josh, one of the questions we've gotten here is about just sort of assessing the level of diversity in the room. Do you have any thoughts on how you would size that up?
Yeah,
Is it really diverse? Is sort of the question.
it's a difficult question to answer, I think, from a U.S. context, because the room it's pulling people from across the world. So each continent, it was able to nominate certain persons to come. I think it was 10 from each bishops' conference, or it depended, I think, on the continent. So they were able to nominate a certain number of people to come, and the Synod office made choices in terms of particularly what lay participants would come. There's also a complicated set of quotas, essentially, for which bishops' conferences and how many bishops they get to bring. And then the Pope is free to make a certain number of choices in terms of bishops on his own authority. This is all governed by a document, it's called Episcopalis Communio. I don't know, is it an apostolic constitution, or I can't remember what its authority level is, but it governs kind of how a synod works, who comes and who gets appointed. But it's a real range of people from really across the world. Chris mentioned yesterday we heard from a lay person from Hong Kong, a lay person from Brazil. We also heard from an Eastern Orthodox bishop, our Archbishop, who gave a perspective of the Eastern Orthodox on synodality and how they consider that concept, and how they consider governance in terms of not only being only the providence of bishops, but occasionally also involving laypersons. And also in the room are 2 bishops from mainland China, which is of course very important to Pope Francis. And I think there were some special negotiations with the Chinese government in terms of allowing them to be in the room and allowing them to stay in Rome during this time. So there's a real breadth and scope of diversity. And obviously, it's not parity in terms of male versus female delegations and membership, but for the first time there are, I think it's about 80 women in the room who are participants, 54 of whom are full members. So for the first time in the history of the institution of the Synod of Bishops since Pope Paul VI created it after the Second Vatican Council. Not just one woman, but 54 are serving as full voting members with full rights equal to those of the bishops in the room who have voting rights.
We've got another question about the environment, and will the responsibilities, our responsibilities as Christians to take care of the poor in the earth be addressed? Will those topics be discussed? And yes, I think we've been told that they're coming up already in small group discussions. That's part of the focus for this week's discussions, one of the formal questions to be considered. And as if there were, as if we didn't have enough to do last week during the opening day of the Synod, Pope Francis released an apostolic exhortation on the environment called Laudate Deum, which means in Latin, praise be. Praise God, which is a follow-up to his 2015 encyclical Laudato Si. And the Pope, as you all probably remember, that was a monumental document when he first wrote on climate change in 2015 and said, the Catholic Church accepts the science on this, and we really have to all act immediately toward combating these climate crises. And he says in this new letter that was just published last week, and you can read all about it at Earthbeat, NCR's environmental publication, that 8 years later, the situation is only getting worse. And he's really trying to nudge people for action, both on the personal level, but specifically at the political and geopolitical level in the lead up to COP28, which is the big UN environmental summit taking place in Dubai at the end of November and the beginning of December. I think this is something that is weighing very heavily on the Pope's mind, and we'll see come up in so many discussions this month. Migration is something that is being discussed a lot in small groups. We've heard so many testimonies about that just in the past 5 days. And you can't talk about migration without dealing with climate change. And so as Pope Francis liked to say, so many of these issues are interconnected. And so you can't really discuss any of these issues on their own, because we are seeing just how affected they are for so many people. So,
yeah, another issue we know has come up and has been mentioned several times is formation, and that was last week especially, particularly formation of priests, but also formation of young people and formation of lay ministers in the Catholic Church. It was something that we heard several times at the Vatican press briefings that it had come up and was an issue that was of interest to the Assembly.
Yeah, we've been told that and we've seen it, that this is a big concern of Pope Francis, that if the Church is to become more synodal, it has to begin, in the seminaries in particular, to train priests and lay people on how to become more synodal. So.
I'm looking through the questions here to see if there's anything we haven't answered that we should get to. If you have any more questions, I think now is the time. Put them in the chat box.
We'll take one or two more questions. Let's see here. I see one of the questions that had been submitted ahead of time that we hadn't got to is about it's saying, I've heard nothing from my parish or archdiocese about the Synod. Is that the norm in the U.S. Or is it just in the Midwest? Any thoughts on that, Josh?
Yeah, we had a lot of coverage of the synodal process over the past year or so. I think there was some varied experience across the country in terms of how involved different dioceses were and how enthusiastic different bishops were about the synodal process as launched by Pope Francis. By and large, I think a lot of the stories we heard were interesting, especially about the American bishops kind of summary document, summarizing some of the issues at play or some of the consultation processes. And that document, quite interestingly, said very openly that there had been discussion at various levels in the U.S. church about some of the issues that are now major items. Ministry of women, the desire for women deacons or women priests, better inclusion of LGBTQ Catholics, and those types of issues. And so now it's interesting that even at the level of the U.S. Bishops Conference, and the U.S. bishops are not any sort of kind of a progressive group, are very openly saying that these are the items that were discussed about in local churches.
Got a question about I believe that a summary was issued on this past weekend of the reports from the small groups. Do we have any insight on that? I mean, those reports from the first sort of session in the individual small groups are not made public. They go back to the general relator, is the official title, the one who will eventually sort of steer and produce the final outcome document, and he'll be working with the whole committee. But someone involved in those reports told me that when in the small groups, each small group has to produce its own summary report that then makes its way on up the chain of command. And that everyone in the small group has to give their assent and say whether or not this summary is an accurate description of what is taking place or what had taken place in our group. And I was told by someone that those small group reports received unanimous sort of assent this time around. So again, there wasn't anything especially controversial last week. So I think perhaps what we might see some more of the divisions play out in the coming weeks ahead. So.